before we dive into any questions, I can just kind of go over really quick. I'll just give you a little bit of background about me so everybody knows. So just a little quick overview. So I went to CU Boulder and studied computer engineering there, but I've been coding since I was 8. I've worked at a bunch of different technology companies, including BEA, which was purchased by Oracle back in the day. They built WebLogic, and then also worked at Orbitz and a variety of other companies, including Texture Media and XOR and others. Those are smaller. I founded FusionAuth. The company's actually called Inversoft, but our product's called FusionAuth. I founded the company about 13 years ago. So we've been in business for about, for 13 years, doing well. And in terms of security, I started studying security when I was at BEA, as well as at Orbitz, and I've been working on security-related things for well over a decade now. So I don't know everything, but I know enough to be dangerous. So feel free to toss out your questions, and yeah, we can just kind of go from there. And if nobody has any questions, I can just dig into.
I can go. I'll go first.
Sure.
Since I'm not shy. So Nashorn is deprecated and Java 11. What are your plans for replacing it?
That's a great question. So we've been actually looking at Graal, as well as some other JavaScript engines that are able to run either in the VM themselves, in the JVM, or as a standalone component. There's ways to sort of like kick off V8 and let it keep running, and then like inject scripts into it and get responses back. So we kicked around a couple of ideas, but yeah, next year will probably be our big upgrade year. So we're gonna not only upgrade Java, probably up to 13, and then we'll start digging into whichever JavaScript library is gonna work best, but likely it's gonna be one of the Graal ones.
Cool, thanks.
Sure. Unless Daniel has other thoughts. Oh, I have Daniel and Brian here as well, so if you guys have any questions that I can't answer, they might be able to. So one thing I know that came up. Oh, sure. Yeah, so Daniel just mentioned if you have a question. So everybody that comes in, so I'm just going to allow everybody to talk. So just keep yourself muted if you don't want to talk, but otherwise just unmute yourself and you can just throw out your questions. Before you ask a question, just briefly introduce yourself and then take it away. One thing I know that's come up quite a bit is sort of we call it identity unification, but essentially what it is a lot of different backends that are legacy or have been built years ago and have their own databases, or might be using another third party, and then everybody wants to sort of combine them into a single view of a user. And I wrote up some slides on this sort of problem, and I was going to go over those really quick unless anyone wants to jump in. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to just jump in and throw them out.
Yeah, I got 2 more questions. This is Paul. Can you hear me?
Yep. Yeah, you're good.
Cool. So I'm trying to understand. So when I create an application in FusionAuth, it always has OAuth automatically configured. Can you explain why that is and what the implications of turning that off are?
So the reason that we did that is just as an application is added, we assume that it's going to want to, allow users to log in, right? So our standard model is to push users into the authorization code grant through OAuth to actually perform the login. And you can disable every grant of it, so you can essentially disable OAuth. But since our standard login workflow is OAuth, we sort of made the assumption that anytime anyone added a new application, that application would want to use OAuth to log people in. So that's
okay. Yeah, so like just to give you an example of where I think I want to turn it off. So if you look at a third-party service provider like G Suite, It has a single sign-on capability. It supports SAML. So we create an application in FusionAuth and we set up SAML, and we can go, and then we go to G Suite and we set up SSO, and we say to use the SAML for authentication in FusionAuth. Actually, you say use the application because you're just basically saying use this application to sign into G Suite. I'm not sure it's super protocol specific, but anyways, and so that works. And then I'm over here looking at this OAuth thing going, well, what's that got to do with anything?
Sure.
Because if I go to G Suite when it's set up this way, I'm redirected to FusionAuth to enter my username and password. And when I do that, then I'm redirected back into G Suite. So I haven't even tried it, but I assume that I can just go and disable the OAuth functionality and everything will continue to work, right?
No. I don't think it will. I'd have to test it.
Sure, I'll test it, but that's why I'm asking the question.
Yeah, so the way that our SAML works is we'll take the SAML request in, we'll process it, verify it, make sure it's all good to go, and then we'll actually translate it to an OAuth. And then we'll push the user down through OAuth. Now, OAuth all the way out, and then what happens is our SAML integration, our SAML endpoint, will actually parse the OAuth response, complete it, translate that OAuth response to a SAML response, and then send that back.
Yeah, see, that's what I thought. I thought that the reason that OAuth is auto-configured on every application is because FusionAuth is an app that a FusionAuth user has to have permission to use to do things like get valid SAML assertions to give to third parties. Like that's how your whole role model and all that, and registering a user to an application, that's all done to control access, FusionAuth users' access to and use of FusionAuth. And one of the services that FusionAuth provides is issuing SAML assertions, but you basically have to be authenticated and authorized to the FusionAuth app itself, and that's done using OAuth, which is why I think it's auto-configured. I guess I was just looking for confirmation.
Yep, so Daniel just actually poked in the code. This has come up before, apparently, I didn't know, and we fixed it. So you can disable OAuth and SAML will still work. So yeah, so you're correct. So all of those statements are correct, and the key is that rather than have like a separate workflow for SAML as like an assertion framework that will include like MFA and forgot password, single sign, and all of that, we basically unified it to one, and we did it around OAuth. So we translate SAML to OAuth. Is essentially the short answer.
Cool. And then the last question is, so I've got a user, a FusionAuth user, and I've got a matching user in G Suite, which seems to be a requirement on the G Suite side. If you can't SAML into G Suite using a FusionAuth user that doesn't have a matching user in G Suite. And I guess that's just because things like the mailbox and all the other user preferences have to be parked somewhere over on the G Suite side. So they require you to have a user. And a lot of other service providers do this. So it seems fairly common. But anyway, so I went into FusionAuth for that FusionAuth user, and I forced them to reset their password. So this is the password that's stored in FusionAuth. Okay. And when I went to sign in as that user, it did force me to change my password. But when I clicked, I entered my new password twice, and I clicked submit, I got this bizarre error saying you don't have permission to administer users in FusionAuth. So then I went and I was like, well, what do I got to do to solve this? And I went and looked at the permissions inside FusionAuth, and those look pretty terrifying. Like, I don't want to just give some random person, user management permissions, which sounds scoped way beyond self-service. Like, there doesn't seem to be like a self-service permission. So then that got me thinking, maybe perhaps, at least for our use case, where our users are never interfacing directly with FusionAuth. We are building an app, and that is the primary interface for all of our customers. So even though FusionAuth might provide something that looks like a self-service workflow for things like resetting a password, we probably don't actually want to use it. We probably want to, because there's like 3 use cases. There's create user, reset password, recover, forgot password. Rather than using those FusionAuth UIs, we just want to use the FusionAuth API and create our own UIs inside our own product to provide all that. And then that way our backend has the proper permissions in FusionAuth to manage users. And we only have to worry about authenticating and authorizing users to use our app. Am I missing something there?
Yeah, so what happened was the link that was in the email or however the login was initiated was actually to feed the FusionAuth admin UI. And so once you had completed it, it basically said, hey, you're not allowed to access this app. And so in FusionAuth, when you first set it up, there's an app called FusionAuth. And that's basically our admin app. And again, I'm kind of guessing on this, but I believe what happened is that you actually like tried to log in and then you logged into the FusionAuth app after you had completed, and the user that was logging in didn't have permissions to that UI. And so that's why it freaked out. And it's like, hey, you can't do that. Like you can't access this. So
yeah, that sounds about right. Because when I added user management permission to that user, they were able to successfully reset their password without that error. Yeah. And they landed in the FusionAuth app, which we never want our users to ever land there.
Yeah, so it really just depends on like sort of how you enter that workflow. So if you enter that workflow from an application like G Suite, when you're done with it, you'll get redirected back to G Suite. And it's all based on client ID. So when you start our OAuth workflow, if you have a client ID, we'll know how to get you back to that app. If we don't have a client ID, we sort of, to some degree, assume you're trying to log into FusionAuth itself. And that's kind of a
Yeah, I think that's exactly what happened. I think instead of going to G Suite and then being redirected to FusionAuth's authentication endpoint, where it would have then forced me to redo my password, I think I went right to the authentication endpoint itself, which is what you just said. It then assumes that I'm supposed to be landing in FusionAuth, which I don't at the time didn't have access
to. So there's ways to fix that. So we can get it to work. We just have to, there's a couple of different ways to get into that path and then get out of it. And it's all predicated around like starting that forgot password or password change workflow correctly. So if you want to just reach out on Slack or email or whatever, we can help you walk through that and fix it.
Yeah, I think it's what I just said though. I think that ultimately for our user community, we don't ever want them to actually be FusionAuth app users in any sense. So, since we're building an app that's the primary UI for our customers, we're going to have to provide UIs for basically anything that is, happening on the FusionAuth side, like creating a user, because we have this notion of like a delegated admin that can create a user inside our app, but ultimately that's going to make a create user call to FusionAuth. But the same thing for like forced password reset or forgot password recovery, all that stuff, we're going to have to provide the UIs, and then those UIs are making the backend calls.
Because otherwise, you don't have to. You can use our UI. It's just we have to have that client ID is basically what it is. So when you start the forgot password workflow or any of those things, it just has to be started properly. So it's
all right. Yeah. So if it's just a matter of skidding the FusionAuth UI to look the way we want it to, and then just sort of configuring it just so and making sure that we're hitting the right, like I think customers still have to, again, like back to that model that we were just talking about with G Suite, I think that they have to hit our application endpoint and then be redirected to FusionAuth for authentication, and then FusionAuth goes, oh, well, the flag is set to force them to reset their password. And then that way, when they reset their password, they land back in our app, rather than having them go directly to FusionAuth where they're supposed to then land in FusionAuth, which we never want. I understand.
Yep, exactly.
All right, I'm done. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, you're welcome. So there's a bunch of other folks that have joined. So the way that I'm doing it really quick is just I'm kind of allowing everybody to talk. So I'm just like sort of unmuting everybody. Everybody's muted to start. So if you have a question, you can just unmute yourself and do it that way. Just until we get to a large number of people, you don't need to raise your hand or anything. I'm just kind of allowing everybody to talk. So there's few enough people in now. So anyway, feel free to unmute yourself and start talking and ask any questions you have. Daniel has one thing he wants to say first.
So I was just going to follow up on, I think that was Paul that was just speaking. A couple of those items have come up in the past. And so one of the ways that we've, and I think, so I'll rephrase one of the issues for the rest of the audience, which is, let's assume for a moment that FusionAuth is hosted at login.acme.com. And if you navigate manually or your users to login acme.com, what FusionAuth does is assume that you're an admin user and it forwards you to the login page for the FusionAuth app. So I think that's what we're alluding to prior, which is then from that page, if you try to reset your password, you'll then be attempted to be redirected back into the FusionAuth app at the end. So one thing that we've proposed, because it's come up a few times, is actually making that base page more of a landing page for FusionAuth and adding an admin button. So it's a much more explicit workflow for an end user to act, if they were to get to the admin login page, it would be a much more explicit action to hopefully reduce some of that confusion.
Maybe.
Yeah, and then also we could put restrictions on that because,
yeah,
I mean, I've had this exact problem before where like you basically don't want the admin work login page or workflow, like you said, exposed publicly.
That's right.
Never a use case for that. It's always just our getting that to go do some admin function, but the non-admin workflow / endpoint, we definitely want to be public because we could have customers anywhere.
That's right. So then the other way you could do it too is on your end is just through a proxy redirect. You could just essentially never allow someone to access that URL directly.
Yeah, that's probably right. In production, we'd have a WAF and there would be no path,
Yep.
no public path to the admin. That's how we would deal with it.
So then
and
you
it
just
doesn't matter. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. And then the other thing was, oh, I know, you were asking about the self-service stuff. So that's, and Brian sort of alluded to it, that's sort of on the roadmap. So the use case being, like you suggested, there's certainly a lot of administrative functions in the user interface. And during the login procedure, there is options for password reset and that type of thing. But that's come up several times, which is to say, from your application, is there a way for you to redirect a user to administrative functions on their own account? Like, can I change my name, email, reset my password, but not have a registration or authorization to the FusionAuth application? So those things are coming, but currently you're right, you'd have to, if you want those features, you'd build them into your own interface with our API.
Well, to some degree. I think some of them, like changing a password, yes, but not change password through the normal login workflow.
That's right.
Or forgot password that was started elsewhere and it doesn't have the client ID.
That's right.
Yeah.
But if you want to provide self-service features for user, like, hey, click here, change your password, type in your current password, you'd build all those today.
Yeah, you have to build those. Like just with like enabling MFA, that's an UI that everybody has to build themselves today, because we don't provide a UI that you can drop somebody into to enable MFA and then kick them back out to your app. So
that's cool. Is your MFA seed base 32 or base 64 encoded?
Either. I think we take both. When you start the MFA, you can send us at base 32 or base 64 and we'll decode it.
Cool. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Like, Nathan, did you have a question? I saw quickly unmute there, but.
A lot of my other questions were already answered.
Nice. All right, cool. Yeah, that's awesome. Is there any, here, let's see. All right, excellent. So this is coming from Arlene. Question on client credential grant support. And so client credential grant is definitely something that's currently logged in GitHub, I think. It's a feature request that we have out there. And what we're actually hoping to do is have some customers sit down with us, spend an hour, go through your needs in terms of client credential grant, what you're looking for, how you want to administer it. And then we're just going to add a bunch more detail to that issue and then add it. And so our current thinking around client credential grant is essentially that you'll have the ability to create, for lack of a better term, we're calling them assets. Asset is essentially just like a computing device, right? It could be like a computer, a server, an application, a backend, an IoT device, whatever it might be. And then for that asset, you'll be able to create a client credential pair that they'll be able to OAuth in to any application and then get an access token. So that's our current thinking around it. But we want to make sure that we're covering everybody's needs in terms of like how they exactly want it to work and what APIs they're going to be looking for that. So if anybody has suggestions, yeah, just let us know. We're happy to set up a short meeting and just kind of, brainstorm, kick around ideas, and then get those into our feature request for that. And Marlene, feel free to unmute yourself if you have other questions and you want to dig in. So.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Yeah, that's one we'll definitely follow up with you on because we do have some input and we voted on that GitHub issue there so for it. And then we'll follow up with you too on the anonymous tokens. I think we had a dialogue going in support with you on that, and looks like we still want to look at that some more with you guys.
Awesome. Yeah, and so for everyone else that doesn't know about anonymous tokens, so basically an anonymous token, the idea that we have around that is that some people call them like token vending machines, and we might adopt that similar type of thinking. And essentially what you do is you ask FusionAuth, you say, hey, I don't know who this user is, but I really need them to be able to call some APIs in my backend. And so I want a validated, signed JWT that I can then use to pass around. And so you can ask for it from our token vending machine, and we'll hand it back. It'll be a valid JWT for an application. And then the user ID in that will be valid. And then you can hook that ID up to a real user later. So if they register later, we'll be able to hook that ID up. The only thing you won't have in there is you won't have, a true identity. You won't know, like, here's their unique identifier, their login ID, any roles. But what you could do is you could potentially be able to pass those in to this API, this vending machine, and we'll echo them back so that later then you could eventually hook them up. And so we have a couple of ideas around that as well. Anyone who's dealing with anonymous users that do need functionality, they want to be able to call APIs in a backend or take actions or do whatever they need to do, and then later might want to hook them up to a real user, just let us know. And so that's definitely a feature that we've heard a number of times, and we're just collecting requirements so that we implement it correctly.
Yeah, thanks, Frank.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so I know that unless anybody has any other questions really quick, one thing that came up with a lot of folks that were sort of trying to do this sort of identity unification. And so that was a big topic on a couple of lists that we were on. And so I kind of wanted to just cover that quickly, although, you all might not have that case right now, but it's an interesting case that we have some solutions for. Let me share my screen and I can sort of walk through that, but feel free to cut me off or jump in at any point if anybody has any other questions. Okay, so we call this enterprise identity unification. And basically what it is it's, an enterprise, maybe let's say they acquire 4 different companies, and each company has their own backend and their own user database, or maybe they're using a third-party tool, but the users are stored in 4 separate locations. And so here's what happens is, we've got clown makeup, awesome travel, cheap handbags, and smelly roses, right? But Joe is our example account, and he actually created an account at each one of these companies over the last, 10 years, let's say. And then Amazon comes in and buys all of them. And so Joe has 4 separate accounts. It would sort of be surprising if Joe, all of these accounts sort of got joined automatically. So Joe sort of thinks that when he goes to each of these websites, they're still might be separate, but like Google did, they might be unified over time. Okay, so so before we had multi-tenants in this is FusionAuth. It used to be called Passport, before we renamed it. But before we had multi-tenants, you sort of always had to have like one view of a user in the database, right? And again, I really need to update these slides, apologize. And so Joe here would have one identity, and here's the problem is that, like, let's say Joe changed his password on cheap handbags. It would also change his password inside FusionAuth, and then he would automatically get his password updated on all the other sites, right? So, so what we did is we sort of built out this, the concept called tenants. I'm sure a lot of you are using them, but what it also allows you to do is you can take all those databases from each of these sites and you can actually dump them into a tenant. And so Joe will still have 4 distinct users across tenants inside FusionAuth, right? So it's just a logical isolation of Joe's account. Okay, so now we have everything actually migrated to FusionAuth. And then what we can do is over time, we can actually start to unify the accounts, right? I'll kind of jump forward a little bit, but yeah, so in this case, if Joe changes his password over here in cheap handbags, he would change it in tenant 2. And so then only that identity would get updated. So his password would not be updated over here on the Smelly Roses, right? Okay, so, so now what we can do is phase 2 of our solution is to start merging these tenants. So now we have to notify Joe. It's like, hey, your identity for, your login for cheap handbags and clown makeup are now going to be joined, and they're going to be called, whatever, Amazon.com email addresses or, identities. And so what you can do is you can actually start merging these tenants. And so Joe's identity across these 2 tenants gets merged into a single one. And so now when Joe logs into either cheap handbags or clown makeup, he would actually have the same login, the same identity. And then you kind of keep pulling this thread until here you merge these 2 tenants. And then at the end of it, you sort of have everybody or all those user identities in a single tenant, right? And so that's sort of the last phase. And so there's a lot of benefits to doing it this way. So in that sort of that first phase, when you're moving everybody into tenants, there's very little risk, right? Because it still looks the same as it did before, which is that every single user database is still logically isolated. It's just not physically isolated like it was in, when in this first slide, right? So in the first slide here, we actually are physically isolated. There's separate DBs. And then, as we scroll down, now they're actually logically isolated inside FusionAuth. But we basically import all the users from each of these apps into a tenant in FusionAuth. So it's lowering the risk for that move into FusionAuth. And then for phase 2, what we can do is we can actually create a new tenant and then merge the users from 2 of the tenants into it. And so there's very low risk there too, right? Because you can always roll back. You can always say oops, that didn't work. We'll just go back to the 4 tenant model, right? So from this step to this step, you can always roll it back. And then the other benefit here is that you can potentially get single sign-on in all these phases as well. That one is a little tricky. FusionAuth doesn't handle that really well right now. It's something that we're working on, but it's possible. So this is a unification of multiple legacy backends into a single IDP, whether it's FusionAuth or something else. But yeah, this is sort of one of the problems that I know a lot of people were solving that we had talked about originally. And so if there's any questions on that, feel free to throw them out. But I thought I'd just throw that out. And so y'all can see what our thoughts on that unification process is. I have a couple more folks join. For the new joiners, I've just been allowing everyone to talk. So if you have a question, you can just unmute yourself and just throw down. we don't have enough participants yet where it would be chaos. But for now, if anybody has a question, just throw it out. Or I can keep rambling on random identity topics. Nathan?
One quick question here. Let's say I was using AWS Cognito or Auth0 before. Do you have a utility or tools to import all the accounts from previous auth providers?
We've built some in the past. We don't have one for Cognito or Auth0. That's actually something I really want to build. I want to have actually a one-click import in our UI that just, you know, takes an Auth0 exporter, a Cognito, and just sucks all the users in. If you have that case, what we've sort of been waiting to find is someone who has that and wants to work with us to build it, right? So if we can get a, you know, an example export or get a secure export and then build the importer for that, we'd love to do that.
And also, I think you briefly touched on one of your last questions. There doesn't seem to be a way to administratively force a password change for a user. It seems as if I would have to build all that out via the API and UI.
Yeah, so in our UI, let me bring that up really quick. Yeah, so in our UI, we added a number of administrative features in version 1.12. Thank you. And hang on, I got too many windows open. I can't see the buttons. Okay, so if you can see my screen, so like up here, we added a number of different options in this little dropdown. And so one of which is to allow them to like reset their password. So you can like basically send off a, you know, send a password reset email. I don't think we have the ability to specify that they, oh yeah, when you edit them. Yeah, so if you go and you just edit the user, you can select from here, require user to change password on next login, right? So that's another thing you can do. So you can both reset their password, force them to change it on their next login, and then send them an email to do so as well.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. All right, so Jerry had a question. All right, so regarding privacy and GDPR, you probably know that the privacy screen that Apple has, which cloaks the personal details, the email. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So, so the question is this. So there's a lot of folks, Apple including, sort of going to this cloaked personal detail type of setup. So like login with Apple doesn't actually provide the email in all cases. So that is something that we are looking to solve. I know there's been some work internally to try and get it to work. Daniel can talk to that more, but I do know that that's something that we're going to be solving probably early next year, is to try and figure out how we can manage these users that come from other identity backends, whether or not it's Apple ID or any of the others, that aren't, that don't have a unique identifier like we do. So they don't either have an email or a username. And they might just have like a unique identifier that end provider is giving to us, like a UUID or something like that. So that's something that we're definitely looking into. Because they're federated only, then we don't necessarily need their email address unless they want to provide it to us. But currently we do require email address or a username in order to create a user inside FusionAuth. But that might be something we'll be changing. And so that's one of the questions. The other one is a grant screen, right? So this is also something that we've kicked around a number of ideas. So if you provide us scopes after they've logged in, there's been talk about providing a grant screen similar to like what Google or Facebook do, where it's like, hey, this app is trying to gain these permissions. And the way that we're looking at addressing that is that inside the application configuration, so if everybody can still see my screen, we will have an option when you go into edit it that will essentially say, show grant screen, or like, ask for confirmation. And then you'll be able to have a variety of scopes that will then have sort of like those questions with them. So like a scope of foo might be actually like, allow this application to edit your profile, right? So we got some ideas around that. I think there's an issue for that. Is there a GitHub issue? Maybe not, but we can do as well as anything that comes out of this, we can add GitHub issues, and then just feel free to jump on those and add, you know, any information that you guys have, any specific use cases, and then upvote it. Obviously, that's a really big indicator for us that we should go build it. But yeah, the grant screen is something that we definitely are going to be implementing, as well as more like a more thorough scope framework for claims. So. Oh, and then one last question that Jerry had was, what's the word on scripted installs without having to bring up the UI? That is definitely something we've seen a lot of, like, really cool workarounds for that, where people will curl through our startup screens to go create an API key and then start calling APIs and all these other really, you know, really interesting workarounds for that. There's a GitHub issue for that. I think Daniel is the one who opened it. Let me go find it. So that one, do you remember what it's called? We've suggested either using like a JSON file or a YAML file. And then when you provide either an environment variable or like a startup parameter or like a flag to FusionAuth, what it'll do is it'll just go read that file and then use that file to provision itself. Issue 170, okay. Silent install, yeah. So an answer file, right? So essentially there's a couple of different ways we might approach this, but this is the issue. It's got plenty of upvotes, so it's likely that we'll be implementing this quite soon. We're doing a little bit of work right now to the FusionAuth.io backend. And so once that's done, we'll probably tackle this one as well as a couple of other ones that have the most upvotes. But yeah, this really the kicker is the authentication keys, the API keys. So a lot of people have been manually inserting these into the database and then using those to start calling APIs. So that way they can provision users and essentially get past that setup wizard and right into FusionAuth. So that's definitely something we'd like to fix, and this is the issue. So anybody who wants to go vote on this or add comments to it, it's issue number 170. So that's, yeah, to answer your question, Jerry, it's coming very soon. Another thing that, if anyone's interested, you can actually, oh yeah, the SQL solution. Yeah, SQL is definitely one way to just jam it in the database. There's some other scripts that people have shared that are pretty interesting. So they'll actually like simulate like opening a browser and clicking around the UI. It's pretty hardcore. But if you are on the FusionAuth issues and you want to sort of see everything that we are working on and doing, if you click sort and then click sort by thumbs ups, this is the ordering that we use for the most part. So as you can see, this, 170 is here. WebAuthn is definitely on the roadmap for early next year. Secure email change, we already have this spec'd out. This is a really interesting feature request with a lot of implications, but it's something we want to do. Essentially what this one is allow users to have multiple email addresses, multiple identities, as well as like change their identities without locking themselves out and not being able to log in. So we've got a bunch of ideas around it, and we have a design doc that we'll probably be sharing, first thing next year. But this is something that we'll be implementing as well. Fine-grained permissions, that one's come up quite a bit. I think the one that's sort of the biggest bang for everyone's buck is actually this LDAP as an identity provider, or as an identity proof. And this is not just LDAP, this is essentially any off-the-wall backend that anyone's ever written for, since the beginning of time. And how do we authenticate users against it? So we have some ideas here, but essentially this one is going to look like us calling an API that will return us a user. So it'll take a username and password, and then it'll return us a user or some variation thereof with maybe some like light wrappers around LDAP, right? So that if we think about all of this as an API, then we get a lot of benefit, right? Because anyone can then implement sort of a thin proxy around an LDAP provider, or a legacy database, or SQL server, or NoSQL, or a flat file, or whatever they have. And then as long as we can auth against that and get back some amount of information about the user, then we'll be able to authenticate them into FusionAuth and then start moving that user data into FusionAuth. So then the next time that they authenticate, we're not calling that backend. We're writing FusionAuth. So this is probably one that we're going to do very soon as well. Oh, sure. Yeah, and so if anyone who's in this FusionAuth issues, if you click on the project view, here's sort of our swim lanes. You can see, what's code complete, what's shipped, anything that's in progress, anything that we're working on, and then things that we're designing out, and then what's on deck, right? So we try to keep this fairly up to date, but yeah, likely, early next year, we're going to be doing another big push around here. So get your votes in, get your comments in, and let us know what everybody wants us to work on. All right. Here's another one that came in. Yeah, so API endpoint to create API keys. So yes, this is the this is the one feature in FusionAuth that's not accessible via the API. And we did it on purpose, right? So yeah, you mentioned this here. We understand that you did not implement for security reasons, but this again goes back to that answer file, right? So we'll be tackling that via the answer file. So you'll actually be able to create API keys during that first initial startup via some sort of like JSON file. So
we could look into doing a CLI for that. I don't know. That
we could do a CLI maybe. I mean, anything that's not an API, right? Unless we like have some like super secure API, way to lock these things down, right? Because that's the one attack vector we want to prevent, is like somebody creates a God API key and then just starts wreaking havoc inside of FusionAuth. All right. Just kind of going back up here. Let me see. A couple of other folks have joined. So I know everybody's either been typing it into the chat or into the Q&A, but I've also just been sort of allowing everyone to talk. So anybody who just joined, feel free to either raise your hand or just unmute yourself and then just throw out your questions. Or I can keep rambling on random identity topics as well. I don't know.
Does anybody on the phone or on the call web meeting have suggestions for better ways that FusionAuth can engage the community or provide any different mechanisms for feedback, such as like what we're doing here? We've discussed doing this more regularly, and we've tried to make ourselves available on Slack, GitHub, Stack Overflow, but we're definitely still looking for ways to grow the community and provide a lot of feedback and mechanisms. So if anybody has any opinions they'd like to share, that'd be great.
Yeah, and Marlene asked about the new OAuth standards. So the like OAuth 2.1 is been proposed, and it's probably going to be, they're going to be going to town in 2020 on that. There's a lot of like unification of the 10 billion OAuth standards, as well as some improvements to OpenID Connect. So one of the big things that I think a lot of people expected, but we'll have to prepare for, is the deprecation of the implicit grant, which in our sort of theory is a good thing, but it's also a bad thing, right? Because it can be very heavily used right now. So one of the things that I think, if you all have not checked it out, let me go ahead and share my screen again. So I wrote an article. Let me bring up my screen. Okay. I wrote some articles on our site. And if you go and let me make my windows a little bit bigger. So this expert advice section, we're actually going to be building this out extensively next year. We hired a writer to help us, and we'll probably be hiring some more developer advocates and some other folks to build this out next year as well. So under authentication, this is sort of one of the pieces that we wrote to just kind of talk about all of these different OAuth standards and how you use them and whether or not you want to use them at all. And so the two that are recommended sort of under all of these buckets are the authorization code grant, but I also cover the implicit grant for single page apps. And in these coverages, what I do is I talk a little bit about some of the implications of this and like why you might not want to do them. Obviously, we can go into like really, really great detail about some of the issues with implicit grant. But one of the biggest problems with implicit grant is that all of the identity information comes back on the URLs. And what we see a lot of people doing is we see a lot of people taking the tokens from the URL and dropping them either into local storage or into cookies via JavaScript. So anytime you drop anything into a cookie via JavaScript or into local storage, it's sort of accessible to the world. So any JavaScript on that page can then read it, and then it can make AJAX calls out to steal it. So this is a possibility, right? So there's a lot of sort of like cross-site scripting attacks where let's say that in your app, you're echoing a piece of data like the user's last name, and you're echoing it without doing the proper escaping. What can happen is that somebody can edit a user's profile and inject JavaScript into their last name or their first name, and then that'll get output to the page, and then that could import a JavaScript library from some external server, and that'll actually be running inside your app. And then what that JavaScript can do is it can just sit there in the background and wait for any cookies or any local storage to be written, and periodically read it, and then ship that off to whatever server they want, right? And so that happens right here in sort of steps 7, 8, 9, and 10. These three steps are sort of how the implicit grant will go to the server, authenticate the user, and then come back to the app, and it'll have these JWTs in the URL, and they're usually like after the hash mark, right? And then what'll happen is it'll rip that JWT off the URL, and the SPA will start consuming it and start using it. So what we recommend is try to find a way to not store those in local storage or to use JavaScript to put them in cookies. And one way that we have here, we call it the cookie drop, but basically what you do is you strip the JWT off the URL, and then you call an API via an AJAX post with that JWT, and then what it does is that the backend echoes it with an HTTP-only secure cookie. And so that cookie is now able to be used anytime you call a backend, and that JWT will be sent across for free just because it's a cookie. And then you'll be able to use that JWT in your backend to identify the user, but the browser won't have access to it. So if there is malicious JavaScript on the page, then it won't have access to that cookie because it's HTTP only. So this is one way to minimize your threat vector, your threat surface, but it's not perfect. And so what they've been saying is like, let's just not support this model. And instead, go ahead and just use the authorization code grant. It'll be really interesting to see how they try to tackle the authorization code grant and making it a little bit lighter or a little bit better. So we'll just kind of have to wait and see to some degree. But yeah, that's going to be one of the biggest changes, the most interesting changes, is sort of telling everyone the implicit code grant is deprecated. Cool. A couple of other things in case anybody hasn't been here in a while, but we sort of broken this expert advice section up into a couple of different sections and tried to provide, just some introductory material for now. We're going to be building this out, but we cover some OAuth stuff. We have a big article coming out just covering more of OAuth 2 and sort of how it fits together. And then we're going to have another one that's on OAuth 2.1, and a lot of the changes, we'll be tracking those. We also built this little dev tool. a couple of different tools that we were providing currently is like a JWT debugger. You can, type in your token, it'll parse it. UUID generator, URL decoding and encoding. These are actually they're open source, and so they're just part of the project for our website. If anybody has any other ideas or wants to throw together their own little tool here, we're collecting those, and we're going to be adding new ones on as well. So feel free to do a pull request if anybody's interested. So like a UUID generator without ads. A lot of the UUID generators that are online are just like riddled with ads, so we built one that doesn't have any ads. So anyway, let's see. All right, so Marlene had a question with respect to like JWS, JWE, what we will support in the future. So Daniel probably can talk to some of this. So yeah, in terms of JSON web tokens and signing, so we support most of them currently. There's been a couple of new signatures that we don't fully support yet, but we support all the elliptic curves. We support all the RSA, HMACs. So a lot of those are already covered. We haven't gone down the path of doing the JWE, which is the JSON Web Token Encryption yet. It's certainly something we can do. We just haven't kind of built that out. We have all the tools in place to encrypt the JWTs. Our library, so we have the library that we actually use is again open source. It's on GitHub. If you go to the FusionAuth project, it's called FusionAuth JWT. So it's our Java JWT library. And actually, it currently is like I think one of the fastest and lightest weight JWT libraries out there. So we have very few dependencies, and we also have the best performance. So if you're in Java and you're looking for a JWT library, check this one out. Again, it's open source. And so what we would do is we would add the JWE and all the other standards that we need to cover here. And then once that's built there, then we can add it to FusionAuth. And what it would be is underneath the application, you would have the possibility of essentially adding that to your JWT configuration.
I'll just ask, along with that question, is there a need, particular requirement, or are you just curious about what we're planning to support in the future?
Yeah, just curious about what you guys are planning to support, and also just thinking about, improvements and just fielding questions from our dev teams and partners, and just that's why I was asking like pros, cons, and what does it really buy us, and how will it get supported, and so just forecasting questions more or less.
The one category that we haven't implemented yet in JWS is I don't even know how to pronounce it, but it's the PF or PS256 and the rest of that schema. And it's interesting because we do support elliptic curve and RSA, and it's amazing how it seems like everybody that in practice, at least from our experience, is using sort of lowest common denominator. Like if you look at even like Google's JWKS or their JSON web key set, it's usually one key and it's RSA 256.
Exactly.
So we haven't seen a huge demand yet for any of the more sophisticated and complex algorithms, because there's always a trade-off for performance. Even the difference between RSA and HMAC is very dramatic for signing and verification speeds. And then the JWE, similarly, we haven't really seen a lot of demand, and that's sort of, in my opinion, sort of a conflict of interest to some degree, because there's a school of thought that says don't put anything in a JSON web token that's sensitive, because it should be lightweight, small, and just give you the facts. And then so generally the idea of encrypting the token would be that I want to put something sensitive in it. Certainly there's probably some legitimate reasons to do that. Doing your best to minimize the weight and the size of the JSON web token, and then just using it for authentication to get more sensitive information. Along with that strategy then comes generally not the need to encrypt. But certainly it's something we've thought about. If people demand it, we'll probably look at adding it.
We'll build it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because I'm feeling the same way. But basically, what you just said is great for, we're building FAQs, and people will have these kind of questions. We don't have a demand currently, but you know how our industry overreacts, and so it's good to know like the pros and cons and what really it's going to buy you, if anything, and just best practices for keeping those tokens lightweight. So we're getting out of some less than ideal practices in moving to that model, and we have an integration. So this is another question: is we have an integration with for our services on the back end with Steel Envoy Sidecar and OPA policies, and being able to present those tokens there and keep all of our authorization logic in OPA. So just curious about any type of integrations with cloud providers or some of these newer frameworks, like what I just described, with how we're planning on using the sidecar with the OPA plugin, or parsing the JWT, looking at, like, we built some roles and then we know what to do with those roles for the authorized functions within the OPA policy. It keeps it out of the JWT body.
Yeah, we have a lot of people using like API gateways or sidecars to take a JWT, inspect it, figure out what permissions that user has, and then either create a new JWT that goes down through all their APIs, or use some other mechanism like API keys or whatever it might be. So seems like a pretty common use case. And from like our perspective, like the best way that we sort of work with people on those things is just through the GitHub, right? So it's like anything that comes up, just, open up a feature request, and we can, tackle it that way. And we build our roadmap basically on that, as well as then, folks that are buying support, and we work, closely with them to just make sure that their features get bumped to the top as well.
Yeah, it sounds great. We're a big fan of the solution and how we've been able to quickly deploy for our immediate use case. And I've described it as kind of a fire and forget, which is what I want. I don't want a lot of dependencies, but I want it to work as designed. And I feel like that's what we've been able to achieve with our deployment and, use of FusionAuth so far. And just happy that you guys have accommodated us in our questions, and roadmap looks really solid, and we hope to continue this mutual relationship of getting better together. So
awesome. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's the way we want it to work. So we want to make it as easy and quick and fast as possible to get everything implemented, and then once it works, it just works. And then, so Paul had a question about mutual TLS to protect JWTs. Can you talk a little bit more about what you were looking for and what you were thinking on that one?
Sure. So JWTs are bearer tokens, aren't they?
Yeah, they can be. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, if you do something like mutual TLS, that where the JWT token is signed, but then through some sort of PKI infrastructure, then for certain that it's being presented by a party that it should be, presented by, and not have been intercepted and being falsely presented by a third party that shouldn't have it.
Dan, you might have to answer that one.
I'm not sure if I quite understand. I think, are you just suggesting that as long as it's presented over TLS, that the payload is trustworthy?
Well, if it's mutual TLS, right? Like, so the problem that was originally presented to the community was with TLS and SSL was that, you got a browser and it goes to a server and you don't really trust. How do you know the server is legitimate? And so they answered that with SSL and then TLS, but servers generally just accept that the client is who they say they are, so there's trust there. And with mutual TLS, both parties are essentially, signing all of their communications, and so there's a two-way trust model. And so I'm just proposing the same thing for the JWT token. Curity has just released this. If you're familiar with Curity, they just released mutual TLS for JWT token.
Okay, yeah, I'm not personally familiar. I'll have to go look at that.
Yeah, we'll have to look it up.
So in this case, the receiving party then is not going to validate the signature on top of that, the JWT signature?
Yeah, I think it's just basically you want to set up a mutually authenticated channel. So both ends are authenticating each other, whereas the typical model with TLS is just one end is authenticating the client is essentially authenticating the server through a trusted root certificate. With
Okay.
mutual TLS, both the server and the client are authenticating each other through trusted root certificates. That's the nature of mutual TLS. And then once a mutual TLS channel is set up, then you can exchange the JWT token.
Okay.
And that way, there's no way for like a man-in-the-middle attack to intercept the JWT and reuse it. You have the same problem, by the way, with IDP-initiated SAML flows. So it would actually be interesting to see if you could do the same thing with IDP-initiated SAML flows, where in that auth flow, the assertion is a bearer token. And all that happens is the service provider goes back to the IDP that issued it and goes, is this valid? And it goes, yes, it's valid. But nobody is checking to see if the party that's presenting the assertion is actually entitled to the assertion, which I think is why it's not used very widely. I mean, service provider initiated SAML flow eliminates that problem.
Mm-hmm.
But there are parties like Amazon that just support IDP initiated flows.
Yeah,
That's actually a little bit different topic, but on that thread, we've recently actually discussed some possible solutions around sort of launch pads for IDP initiated logins. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
yeah, we were talking with Paul about that.
Okay.
Yeah, so yeah, that was just how do we get people into those IDP initiated flows through FusionAuth, right? So like who generates the SAML request is basically what it comes down to. I mean, and it's SAML in and of itself is that's it to some degree the ACS, the callback has to be known, but yeah, unless it's an SP initiated flow, then you lose some of the benefit that you get from OAuth, which is like when it's initiated, you have a client ID, you have a redirect URI, and both those things have to be known, right? And so you have the security of knowing that the person that initiated it and that the place you'll be sending them back to are both known. And then during the token handshake, you'll have that client ID and client secret, which is another layer. So you'll have that through your authentication mechanism, and then you'll be presenting them with a signed JWT. So overall, it's a pretty robust, and all that's happening over TLS anyway. So, and then in terms of the JWT exchange, in terms of mutual TLS, yeah, I mean, I guess if both parties are asserting themselves and basically saying, this is who I am, here's my root, both parties have a signed certificate that's from a root, then the TLS itself is very robust. But I guess the JWT would just flow over that TLS channel and then be verified as normal anyway. So yeah, we'll definitely have to read up on that and see how the JWT comes into play and whether or not the certificate that was used to sign the JWT has the same root as one of the parties of the mutual TLS.
Yeah, like I don't know if you ever played like a Wi-Fi pineapple, but you can man the middle people and get their JWT tokens pretty trivially.
Interesting. Yeah, we'll definitely have to like do some research and see how we implement that if needed. So.
Yeah, get a Wi-Fi pineapple and expense it. It's fun to play with.
Nice. Yeah, I love playing around with that stuff.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else?
Does anybody want to throw out what's a feature that we're missing that would either put it over the top for you, or that seems obvious, that like an obvious omission on FusionAuth's part, or just a dream feature? Anything come to mind?
Yeah, I had one, and this is just because we're doing, so tying into change management controls. So we kind of went crazy just building out, tenants and apps and testing things and figuring out how we wanted to structure our environment. And then now that we've got a good handle on it, we're going to go off and do some cleanup. So I just chatted in the chat. One question was, what's the best way to sort of clean up the well-known JWTs info, and because it's just crazy with a lot of stuff that we're not using. So I was thinking if I went ahead and deleted those in Keymaster, would they automatically update and clean up in the HTTP, JWTs page? So that's question number one.
Yeah, they should.
Yeah, those
okay,
are
cool.
directly related. Yeah.
Yep, I thought so. And so they'll clean up on their own, and I'll refresh, and like after 10 or 20 minutes, and it'll be cleaned up, which is good.
I think it's instantaneous, actually.
It's instant. Yeah.
Oh, really? Yeah, that's such a great feature. Okay, because I have a story. I got to go clean up a whole bunch of keys. And then the other one is, so I noticed, like, with change management, we've got a couple of admins working and building stuff out, and now we're trying to lock it down and put in our change management practices. And I always wish that there was a place to maybe put some notes, and maybe it's too much to ask, but even just little comments about some of the things, but it's not really necessary. But I wondered if anybody else was thinking about how to tie that in with, like, a place to put a JIRA issue or whatever your change management practice is, just a small comment field. I know I have the audit logs, and we've moved those into Splunk, so I can always, look and see from an audit standpoint about the changes. But that was another question, is just more on the admin side of it and tying it into notes about changes or.
Yeah,
So
documentation of it.
If I could echo that back, you're like, if I were to go and make an edit to an application configuration, if there was a way to add a note to that change on that before you hit the submit button, that would then be added to the audit log.
Yeah, something like that would be really helpful, because we're kind of tracking it amongst ourselves, but over time, we may forget why we did something, or someone could do something that could cause an issue with the way that we've integrated how we're calling the tokens with our React front end, and cause some bug issues. But that's what I was thinking, is it would be nice to have a little feature like that to put.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be cool. Like if we enabled it at the global level, and then when you click submit on anything that's being audited, it just pops up a little dialogue and says, like, hey, leave a comment, or know why you did that.
Doesn't have to be a whole big dialogue, but even if I could just put some small comments in there, just to tie it to our tracking we're using JIRA right now, but it could be anything, right? A change control request.
Yeah.
So what if what if it was enabled based on the user role or some other policy that says when Marlene is in FusionAuth app and she makes changes, a comment is required, kind of like on Windows servers when you try to reboot it and forces you to say why you're rebooting.
Yeah.
So then, because otherwise, if it's optional, it becomes less useful for you, probably, because then you don't know if they chose not to, or if they just didn't have anything to say, or
I like the safety feature of having to type in delete, in certain cases where nothing's going to happen with an accidental fat finger, but something like that would be on roll, like for the domain admin, for example, or global admin rather, that we would put in a comment, and even if someone bypasses it because they don't see the value in it, that's fine. But for us, we would be putting in something that would track back to a change management, a reason why we're going in there and making changes.
Okay. Yeah, I'll take a note here.
It's a nice to have feature, and again, not necessary, but I've come up with a way to, we had a whole bunch of applications and tenants we were going to delete, so I just put a note, change the name to mark for deletion, and something like that. So we could have a couple cycles of making sure it wasn't being used anywhere before we actually went off and deleted those. And then now we're going to go and do some key cleanup. But things like that made me realize that, hey, it would be nice to put some notes for change management but not to go crazy and make it a change management system either. I'm not requesting something like that.
Sure. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I like the attaching it to like a user, like maybe it's a per user, or like you give them a role or something like that. So yeah, we can definitely kick around some ideas. I think Daniel's open a feature request right now, so that makes sense. You know, it follows the pattern, especially with all the regulations and requirements now for tracking this stuff. I think it's really key to have that.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah.
I'll also be contacting support today. We're still having issues with a webhook, and I looked in, I don't know if there's actually a bug or if it's just something with the way we, maybe it's a network issue on our end, but the logs on FusionAuth aren't really saying much. It's just a 403 error, and so that's something I'll be reaching out. But just in general, webhooks, are they, any known issues or?
Not that we know of. So there's some things we're looking at doing in terms of just how we manage the retries and sort of the transactionality of webhooks. So the transaction setting for webhooks is really important for how the events are sent, and then what happens to the transaction that's initiated that event. So if you're creating a user and all your webhooks are set to be transactional, and any of them fail, then we sort of roll that transaction back. And so those things are really key to just understanding like how we send the event and how we manage the responses that we get back from the webhook. But in terms of just the send, it's really just based on the configuration. And so there's some nuances with like SO timeouts, connect timeouts, read-write timeouts, and those sort of things. It's kind of tricky, but if your webhook is unavailable or not responding really, really quickly, you can run into issues. It's kind of one of those things, like let's say you have a connect timeout of a second and then you have a read-write timeout of like a second. We'll try and connect to that endpoint. If we connect to it and then we start writing the initial bytes, but we never get like an acknowledgement from that server, it could time out like OS level timeout, right? So it could be like 5 minutes. So there's like a lot of like sort of nuances when it comes to just the networking of webhooks that you kind of have to take into consideration. But yeah, I mean, like if you're getting weird responses, or your webhooks are sending 200s, but then FusionAuth's rolling back the transaction, that would be problematic. So yeah, I mean, definitely reach out to support and let us know like what might be happening, and we can look into it, because they should just work for the most part.
Yeah, that's what we thought too. So I'll reach out. It's just on the user registration. So just user registration create. We have a customer microservice, and we want to be able to take the FusionAuth user ID and user identity, which is just their email address at this time, and inject that into our customer microservice and match that up with other customer information in that service. And so we're only getting a 403 error. It's probably on our side, but I'm not getting anything more to troubleshoot within the FusionAuth logs other than the 403. So it's probably something we're on our side, and we were not sure if our hosted IP is using, we have a static IP, and we're not sure if it's the same IP that's sending these webhook outbound requests, and maybe we need to whitelist something or deal with the network configuration on our end. So anyway, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We can definitely look into it, and we'll figure it out for sure. And those things should be going to the event log. So if you're not seeing anything, we can look at the system logs, and we can investigate.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Anybody else have any questions?
Will you be doing these kind of on a quarterly basis or something? I think it's really helpful. What's the thinking about, these kind of web events?
Yeah, I mean, our thinking was originally to start doing them monthly and make it pretty consistent, like the second Tuesday of every month, right? Or whatever it might be. So this is our first one. We just kind of wanted to get a feel for it, sort of see how it worked. It seems like it's a pretty good format, and I know a lot of people kind of had FusionAuth specific questions, but we're also happy to just talk about, we talked a little bit about sort of like new OAuth specs and like other things that we should be reading and investigating. So that's great. But yeah, my plan is to sort of start rolling these every month.
Thank you. I think that would be super helpful for us, and just getting a lot of value out of even today. So thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, we really also enjoy just hearing how people are using FusionAuth. So like one of the things that, can happen often when people just download it and start using it is we sort of like lose track of them and like the fact that they're using it and like what they're doing with it. So hearing these use cases is great, right? So that's knowing that like you're throwing the user registration event into a microservice, consuming it, and like maybe attaching it to some other profile information you have in your backend. Is just really helpful for us to know those use cases around webhooks. So that way we ensure that, we're handling failures better, or we're logging, really good information. So it's just really good to hear those things.
Marlene, I wonder if you could,
Yep.
when you configure your webhooks, I wonder if you want to try setting each webhook to all applications with a toggle instead of selecting an application.
Okay.
There's some nuances around that configuration that's confusing for most people, and we might end up yanking it because it's not straightforward.
It's really wonky.
That's probably the case. There's a few webhooks we consider application. They're not what you think.
Okay.
So what's probably happening is we're just saying, oh, that webhook's not supposed to send that event.
And I saw that also. I looked and I saw that that was a tractation. I wondered if maybe I needed to do that. So basically, I'll go into my webhook under applications. I'll set it to all applications, fire it off again, and see if it's actually getting through. And if it is, then yay for us, and we'll
right.
we'll track on that bug that I saw.
I believe that's the case. But if not, let us know and we'll give you a hand.
Yeah.
And I actually had not tried that because I thought, let me hold off and just ask support. But I did read that, so I'm going to go ahead and try it. It's easy to do, and I'll let you guys know.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and let us that's another thing is like some of these concepts have been around. They're sort of historical. They've been around for years and years. So having webhooks assigned to like apps makes sense for some very specific events. Like I'm logging into this app, therefore I'm going to send that event to this webhook that's listening for that event in that app. But overall, we also send the application IDs almost for every event. So we're kind of thinking about dropping that completely and just having all webhooks listen for whatever events they've been assigned. And then if you want to weed out some of them, you can do so on your side by just looking for application IDs. That might reduce a lot of the confusion that we've had around webhooks and applications. So anyway, just let us know. As you get into it, be like, hey, you should delete this application configuration on a webhook. It doesn't make any sense.
Awesome. Okay, yeah, I tried it, still getting the same error, so I'm just going to raise it something with support. I think it's on our end, but thanks for that acknowledgement, because I did read that, setting it to all applications, so good to know.
Cool, okay. Had a few more people join. So the folks that had joined, feel free to just unmute yourself, ask any questions you want, or just throw them into the chat or into the Q&A, and we'll answer them. And again, feel free also, one of the other things we didn't really specify, but we will probably going forward for the future ones, is that this can be just sort of like a come and go. We'll likely just open these up for at least an hour, maybe two. People can feel free to just come and go as they please, right? So it's like if you want to come, ask a question, that's the only one you have, and then leave, that's fine. So feel free to just join whenever. See, if there's no other questions, I'm gonna go ahead and just leave this open. But yeah, feel free to just hang out or split if you guys have work to do. And then any of the folks that recently joined, if you have any questions, just feel free to unmute yourself and go to town.
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah.
English isn't my first language, so I apologize for any confusions. We're a small startup and we're trying to implement central authentication for both our employees and our customers.
Mm-hmm.
We'd love to use LDAP for our employees. Is that something FusionAuth supports? I'm not really familiar with the product. I just saw the post on Hacker News and thought I'd join.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, thanks for joining. So we actually have a feature request open for LDAP specifically, but let me ask you, sort of, rephrase that and send it back to you. What LDAP system are you currently using for your employees, and how are you, envisioning hooking it up?
We don't yet have a specific LDAP solution. We're also considering Active Directory. We want to support logins for our systems, like operating systems. So we're strongly considering Samba right now. And I don't really have put much thought into how to connect it.
Okay. Yeah, so if you're using a system like Active Directory, which then you can hook up to your, Samba and hook up to your OS level login, you can actually federate to Active Directory currently just using either OpenID Connect or SAML. And so the way that looks is that, you go to your login page and it says, there's a couple of different ways that FusionAuth handles it, but one of the ways is you just have a button that says, log in with the, the company Active Directory. Or the other way to handle it is what we call domain-based logins, which is you would type in your email address as the first step, and then it would kick you over to your Active Directory. You would log in there, and then you would come back, and FusionAuth would basically complete that login and set up an account for you if it needs to. And so those are the two ways we currently support. If you end up with an LDAP system that doesn't support OpenID Connect or SAML, then we do have a feature request open. We were just actually looking at it a little bit ago. I believe the feature request is, remember the
171 maybe?
Yeah, it's, let me go find it really quick. It's actually one of our highest rated feature requests. And it's just to implement LDAP as an identity provider. It's 219. And so 219 is the issue for that. And so we're definitely going to be implementing this so that way we can use LDAP as a sort of an authentication proof, right? So it's not a federated login. So those unfamiliar with all the terminology, federated login is basically just go over there, log in, and then come back here. Where this is an identity proof. That's basically like, I'm logging you in, but you're not stored in my database, you're stored in some external database. So I need to go prove that you are who you say you are outside of the IDP. And so we are going to be implementing that, and that's an open feature request.
That's basically what I'm looking for. Yeah.
Yep.
That sounds good.
Yeah. So I don't have a timeline for that for you, but yeah, just know that we are, and
yeah, I just subscribe to the issue, the open. Yeah. One other thing I'd need is custom claims in the JWT token. Is that something I can do with FusionAuth?
Yeah, so we have a system called Lambdas. And so when you're in the FusionAuth UI, actually, let me bring it up and I'll just show you. Hang on really quick. Let me share my screen. Go. So if you can see my screen, inside the FusionAuth UI, what you would do is you would come over and you create a Lambda. And we have a couple of different types. And this one, the one that you would want would be the JWT populate. So I'm just going to call this custom claims for now. And what you would do is you basically, inside the JWT, you can add any claims that you want. So I'm going to add one called
looks very nice, yeah.
And it's going to be equal to the user's first name. Right? So I can add any claims that I want to the JWT.
Oh, that's perfect. That's way better than how Keycloak, for example, handles it.
Cool. Yeah,
that's nice. Yeah.
Yeah. One thing that is, again, another feature request, we just we haven't quite got to yet is the ability to call external APIs and go fetch additional details about the user to stuff them into the JWT. So again, we're getting there. We'll have the ability to call that. We're probably going to use either the fetch style or the request style for our external calls. But just know that that's also coming very soon as well. So we'll be able to call to an external API and then populate the JWT. The thing that's kind of tricky here is that we need it to be synchronous because we want that JWT to be fully populated before we return it from FusionAuth.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So whatever we do will probably not be very promise-based, or if it is promise-based, you'll be forced to complete the promise before it returns here. So.
Okay. Yeah, that looks very promising. I think I'll play around with FusionAuth. Do you support multiple backends for one client? Like I have one application and I want to sign in, but I don't want to keep employees and customers in the same database, if that makes sense.
So you can actually just set up as many instances of FusionAuth as you want and point them at different databases. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is through tenants. They would still be in the same database, but they would be logically isolated inside that database. So that's another way to do it. It's entirely up to you how you would want to, deploy it and make it most effective for your requirements.
All right. Yeah, I understand. Cool. I think that's it for my questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It was very helpful.
Yeah, you're welcome. And another thing, feel free to join our Slack channel when you get going. We have a pretty good community. I think we're, I don't know, well over 100.
Yeah,
right?
140 or something.
140 or so people in there. So it's a good community. And then, yeah, we'll be able to answer any questions there, or another community member will.
Sure. Yeah, sounds good.
Cool.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Well, I'm happy to hang out for as much more time as anyone wants, but we can also wrap it for this month and then do this again next month. Well, yeah. Unless anybody has any other questions, I think we'll just close it out, and you can always ask us anything on Slack or hit us up via support or GitHub as well. Paul, did you have one before we split?
Nope, I was just going to say thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for the time, everybody. Thanks for joining. Have a great holiday, whatever you guys might be up to. I know I'm taking some time, so maybe even go skiing. The weather's been insane lately, but yeah. All right. Well, yeah, thanks again, everyone. And we'll talk to you hopefully soon. And if not, we'll do another one of these next year.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
My pleasure.